the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State page. And whenever you're ready, we can begin. Would you like a brief introduction of the consortium?
Sure, please do that.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for stopping by with us today. You are viewing the webinar series that the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State has started to highlight the history of the Underground Railroad and abolition all across New York State. Most of our hosts and presenters are historians and representatives of research institutes, museums, universities, all focusing on the history of abolition across New York State. We are thrilled to host one of our partners, Peter A. Bunten of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project, and we cannot wait to hear everything he has to say. We will be recording live, and at the end of the presentation, we will have time for some Q&A. In the meantime, though, everyone feel free to mute your audio, and we will field questions in the chat window if you'd like to take down some notes.
Okay, Sage, thanks very much for that introduction. I'm excited for today's presentation, but more generally for this whole series of webinars that the IRCNES organization has been sponsoring. As Sage mentioned, and I know a number of you on viewing this know me through the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project, and we came out of a group of historians and educators and local folks who were interested in this history in Dutchess County around 2006. We went through a period of several years of researching the history of slavery and anti-slavery in the Hudson Valley, primarily focused on Dutchess County. We put out a guidebook to places and people in the county in 2010. And as a follow-up, a few years later, we issued a booklet of anti-slavery songs. We've done a lot of interpretation of the material that we found, and we've given several dozen presentations to audiences such as yourselves here today. And we've also done school programs and teacher programs on understanding abolition through songs and also through runaway slave ads. My talk today is somewhat of an experiment, so I will gladly take criticism and ideas when we get to the end. The title, Spaces of Danger, comes out of geography. Since the 1960s, historians have been identifying the Atlantic area as a unified space in which to conduct historical analysis, and using the Atlantic area as what they would call an organizing principle in the study of geography then, but going on to much more since. It might have proven a rather unwieldy subject if they just stuck to water and stones and people, etc., because of such wide expanse, varieties of countries and people. So how does one identify an organizing principle, an organizing theme? We come to that by not limiting the topic to a single place or time period. We're actually studying people through time and across the area of the Atlantic. And that's the way that we create this Atlantic perspective. The people that were first studied, led the way, were kidnapped Africans. Historian Philip Curtin had worked for several decades identifying multiple connections between Eastern and Western Atlantic trade involving the African diaspora. His seminal work, The Atlantic Slave Trade, was published way back in 1969. It's an example of how this approach put African captives at the center of the story, tracking transmissions of all elements of culture. But also, this approach allowed us to understand the impact of this movement on the diaspora. The oceans, one historian wrote, the ocean was not just a place within which people circulated, it was itself the place within which they had transformative experiences. The transformative experiences of the African diaspora certainly were not ones of joy. As part of this organizing principle of the Atlantic region, by extension, the lands abutting the water themselves became what they called virtual seas. There were their own spaces of danger, no less than the water, for kidnapped Africans anywhere along the Atlantic circumference and as far inland as they were taken. Their transformative experience is that they were everywhere and at every time at risk. Every place became a space of danger where mishap and tragedy might strike at any time. This is a small map. Some of you may actually have seen this of the Atlantic region across and through which existed those spaces of danger. Roughly 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homes and brought to the New World, with a relatively small number of those, somewhere around 400,000, coming to North America. We're not going to dwell on the Middle Passage, except to note two things. The first ship is the first point we want to illustrate is the extent of the danger facing Africans on this part of their journey. The voyage could take anywhere from 25 to 30 days at the shortest time for up to 3 months. The average mortality rate was around 12 to 15% over the entire period, meaning that at least 1.5 and probably closer to 2 million died during the voyage. The irony of space can be sensed here in this other famous drawing of one of the larger of the slave ships. How little of that space was allotted to Africans during the Middle Passage. This was one of the, by the way, we're going to meet Lucretia Mott in a few minutes, and this was one of the diagrams that she learned during her schooling at 9 Partners in Dutchess County. The second is what the Middle Passage brings. The second item is that the Middle Passage can bring us directly into the Hudson Valley. One of the ships plying trade across the Atlantic at this time was a small vessel called the Charles. It was commissioned out of New York Colony to bring back Africans and other goods. Now the Charles, after picking up some supplies in Europe, boarded 146 Africans along the coast, and they headed back across the Atlantic. By the time it got to Barbados, only 105 of those 146 remained alive. It dropped off 96 of those and then headed to Rye, where Frederick Phillips took possession of the remaining 9 Africans. And they became the nucleus of his manor. It was one of the largest plantations in New York, taking up all of modern-day Westchester County. Outside of New York City, the manor became home to one of the largest populations of enslaved people, with slaves also being owned by many of the tenant farmers. Now, more than any other mainland colony, New Netherland, later New York, depended on slave labor. Outside of New Amsterdam and Long Island, these early years of settlement in New York saw only a handful of enslaved people here and there, but by the late 1600s, population began to grow throughout the province. And by the end of the 1600s, New York flour and other goods were being shipped down the Hudson to go to the West Indies. Prior to the opening of the Midwest, New York's Hudson region was the breadbasket for the colonies that relied on agricultural slave labor. So now that we're here, this is the area we're talking about. This is the counties designated as the Valley counties, and we're going to concentrate in those green counties: Dutchess, Ulster, Putnam. Putnam was actually part of Dutchess until the early 1800s, Orange County, and within that area, most of our focus will be on Dutchess. So Dutchess had a very inauspicious beginning. Let's go, there we go. Few people had settled on the eastern side of the Hudson Valley in the early years of Dutch and English ownership. And from Westchester all the way up to modern day Albany, the land was granted in huge chunks, owned and run by manorial barons or their appointees. Phillipsburg Manor comprised, as we said, the entirety of Westchester. Livingston Manor and others covered the middle of the Hudson River area. From its birth in 1683 until 1713, the population of Dutchess was so low that it was attached to Ulster County for purposes of administration. Even as late as 1731, Dutchess ranked last in population, only 1,724 persons among New York's counties. Population grew steadily, though, as those early decades proceeded. So by the time of his census taken in 1737, there were more than 300 white people and already 262 enslaved living in the county. And that comprised about, the slaves comprised about 8%. There were 518 different family names recorded in the county assessment for that year. And this quick growth reflected similar gains in the counties, other counties north of New York City, including Ulster and points north. The Rhinebeck and Beekman patents granted a major role to the baronial land settlement in Dutchess County. The number of families on those two patents accounted for almost half of the families recorded in that 1737 year. Conditions were changing rapidly. The fur trade in northern and western New York was in decline. New York City was growing in importance as a trade post for the entire British Empire in the Americas, and demand for foodstuffs and other raw and finished goods was growing substantially. These two developments pushed the barons to diversify their interests, and they subsequently loosened their grip on the plantations, allowing more people to purchase their own farm. The net result was that in the half century from 1723 to roughly 1770, Dutchess population grew 20-fold to more than 22,000 residents. It jumped from least to second most populous county. It was the fertile and stream-filled eastern side of the Hudson River, and there Dutchess was ripe for playing a big role in the new economy, and as would slavery. Although we're not looking much at Ulster County across the river, we can see it as a kind of mirror to Dutchess, rocky and hilly along the river, but rich farmland as you move inland, and a large number of enslaved people. So to satisfy the demands of the New York City ports for agricultural and other products, farmers in Dutchess, Ulster, and other points in the valley needed more and more people to do the work. But there was a labor shortage. Small farmers, small farms able to rely only on their own family members struggled to survive. So they would often take advantage of the market demand, or it prevented them from taking full advantage of the market demand. The large farmers, who were bundled mostly along the river, were tied closely to those outside markets, but there still was not enough surplus white labor available. So a lot of these farmers quickly moved to using enslaved Black people. So overall, as you know, slavery endured in New York from the 1620s to the 1820s. The state had a larger concentration of enslaved people than any other state north of Maryland. And during the period up to 1800, the enslaved population in Dutchess remained around the 8% level, 8% total of New York. Now, since we're focusing mostly in this later period for our history involving the Underground Railroad and other conditions, we're going to spend the remainder of the talk today looking more closely at anti-slavery activities, abolitionism, and Underground Railroad activities in the county. So in 1785, amid the liberating influence of the Revolutionary War, New York banned the further importation of slaves for sale. And after 1788, the state permitted slave owners to free their human property. And despite resistance from slaveholders, a 1799 New York law finally provided a process of gradual abolition. It was a process and would take another 20 years for it to play out. Initially, all enslaved children born after July 4th, 1779 were to be free. Then in 1817, there was another iteration. And finally, all enslaved people were free as of July 4th, 1827. There were still a few that had some type of indenture service, but essentially the state finally rid itself of slavery at that time. New York was being pulled in many directions on the question of slavery and freedom and whether free Black men should be given the right to vote. No less a person than James Talmadge, instigator of the call for the end of slavery as a condition of the Missouri Territories Union entry into the Union, was lukewarm in his support for Black suffrage. There are too many examples to spend time on here, but this refusal of the vote is an example of white leaders' grudging agreement to allow Blacks to have some control over their own space, but not enough that would allow them any control over white space. Dutchess County eventually came to be known as a hotbed of anti-slavery. Anti-slavery rhetoric, prayer, petitions, actions would soon be found across the county, from Rhinebeck to Poughkeepsie to Fishkill along the river, and across and along the farthest eastern point, the stretch of land running from Putnam up to Columbia along Connecticut's border, known as the Oblong. Poughkeepsie had, for several years, made a strong connection in these affairs with New York City. But there was at least as strong a reaction in the anti-slavery actions in the Valley. And this made for some exciting and historically important developments. Here are a series of points in the Hudson Valley where Underground Railroad activity has been, I hesitate to use the word proven, but in some cases, yes. In other cases, there is some strong evidence. And in some other cases, there is some of the evidence is not as hard as we would like it to be. At least where we work out of in Dutchess County, it's very difficult to use the phrase "we know" when it's linked, of course, to something we can prove. And if we take a look at Judy Wellman's scale or Diane Miller's Network to Freedom criteria for certifying an Underground Railroad location, I'm not talking all about people here, but locations, it becomes a little dicier. Let me lay out what we know or have strong suspicions about to help us understand this better. So here's our challenges that we always have to face, and not just in Dutchess, in other places around New York State. What is the evidence? Do we know roots? How many numbers are we talking about? What time frame are we talking about? I think the time frame, as we're going to see in just a minute with runaway slave ads, we have a very good hold on the time frame. Numbers, less so. Roots, we're okay pretty much on roots until we get to the middle decades of the 1800s. And the evidence, as I just indicated, can be a little bit more challenging. Let's first start with what I call the underground before the railroad. And what we're talking about here are the hundreds and hundreds of people that we know about, took the risk of running from their enslavement. Now, going all the way back to the early 1600s in places like Georgia and Virginia, enslaved Black people were running away from the spaces that they were forced to occupy. There are countless notices posted by owners calling for folks to be on the lookout for what they called runaways and what we might rather call today freedom seekers. I prayed for 20 years, said Frederick Douglass, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. And that was no less so right here in Dutchess County. A recent study, the book whose name is In Defiance, found over 600 runaway slave ads for individuals escaping enslavement in the Hudson Valley. Dutchess was first and Ulster second, accounting for about 209 of those notices, or about 35%. And they crossed along all of the other counties within the Hudson Valley area. 80% of these freedom seekers were men, more than half between the ages of 10 and 30 years old. The earliest ads show up in 1735, right about that time when we just talked a few minutes ago, when population was beginning to grow in the county and the need for more labor was beginning to grow as well. So 1735 is several decades, obviously, before that period of time when we generally think about beginning to use the term Underground Railroad. In almost all cases, we know the names of the owners of the runaway, but in many cases, we don't know the names of the runaways themselves. So you're going to hear a lot of other names in the next few minutes, but there are 607 whose names I'm not going to dwell on very much today, but to whom we should give much more notice. So the first of two trails that we identify in Dutchess County are the Quaker Trail to Freedom, and that passed through, as I mentioned, the far eastern side of the county. That involved Quaker meeting sites such as the Oblong, located near Paulding, Nine Partners up near Millbrook, Oswego near a site called Moore's Mill in kind of the center-west area, center-east area. These were part of the Quaker Trail to Freedom. Those meetings in Dutchess County were pieces of a long necklace, if you will, of Quaker meetings that extended from New York City all the way up to as far as Vermont at a site known as the Rokeby Farm near Burlington. The Oblong Nine Partners and Oswego meetings played leading roles in the anti-slavery movement. And in some cases, we know they played a role in the Underground Railroad. The Nine Partners meeting, which is the building here on the right side, the color photography one is of the Oblong meeting at Paulding Hill. If you're ever down this way and you have a few minutes, you should definitely go take a look at the Paulding. That was the second meeting house that was built. The original one was damaged and turned out to be too small. The line drawing here of the Nine Partners is similar in structure to the one that stands there today. The one today is brick. So it had Nine Partners had a school attached to it, which became a way station for freedom seekers.
We have as evidence at least one runaway ad in which the owner, Anne Long, says of her slave, the slave's name was Mary, quote, "I have heard of her being at the 9 Partners." Jacob and Deborah Willard's big anti-slavery people who taught at the school. There is some evidence in terms of letters and writing indicating that they were almost certainly involved in the Underground Railroad. David Irish, we're going to see again in a few minutes, was known for having freedom seekers living in his own home, eating meals with them. Quote, "There was no distinction made in the family on account of color. The runaway was treated as an equal." At the Oswego Friends meeting lived Alfred and Charlotte Haight, who were clearly supporters, and as was their extended family had been in Westchester County. A gentleman by the name of Valentine Halleck crossed several meetings. He was a member of the 9 Partners, and he also had connections at Oswego and across the river at the Milton meeting in Marlborough. There is evidence that he would use the horse ferry down by Fishkill to bring fugitives back and forth across the river. Not only Quakers here, but there were also 2 what we call free Black communities, one at Lithgow, closer to Millbrook, and one at Freemanville, somewhat closer to where Pauling was, near the other site. So this, in 1767, an event occurred that put the Dutchess County Quakers essentially in the leadership role of pushing anti-slavery principles onto the Quaker family as a whole. It was something called the Query. And it's an exciting story that provided some really telling evidence about the history of Quakers and their relation to slavery and where the new movement of Quakerism was heading. The query they sent to the quarterly meeting at Purchase posed 5 questions, all meant to get at essentially, why should Quakers be holding slaves? It was a full-blown questioning of the accepted Quaker way of life. The Purchase was aggrieved by this. So to look at these, isn't slavery a harm to both slave and owner? Doesn't slavery deny the slave freedom to obey his or her inner light? The oblong question, the buying and selling of slaves and owning them. They also asked, should Quakers free their existing slaves? And how can we be diligent Quakers and maintain slavery? So Purchase considered this query or question impertinent, and they ignored it and sent the query on to the New York annual meeting. And it took about 2 years for the New York annual meeting to move forward with a more extensive movement to ending slavery among Quakers. But even while the oblong was sending this query, the 9 Partners meeting just a few miles up the road wasn't waiting for approval. As early as 1759, 9 Partners was bringing complaints against its slave-owning members and disowned those who refused to comply with the new anti-slavery rule. The other Quaker meetings in Dutchess followed suit, but it took until 1790 before the last slave owned by Dutchess County Quakers was free. So there was a fair amount of resistance among Quakers still, and it took almost to the turn of the century. Now, by that turn, by the beginning of 19th century, most Quakers had moved over to an anti-slavery position, but not all supported immediate abolition. Many Quakers in Dutchess County and elsewhere in New York joined the New York Manumission Society that was created in 1785 by some of New York's wealthiest and most influential white citizens, including such people as John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. However, the Quakers moved strongly into the 19th century and were taking a much stronger position on the issue of slavery. There were three leading voices hailing from Dutchess County, all born or having strong ties with the county. Lucretia Mott, David Irish, who we talked earlier about, and Aaron Powell. And their actions brought them close to, and in some cases, directly part of the Underground Railroad. Mott, of course, was a giant in the anti-slavery movement, both as a Quaker and as a woman. For her, devotion to her inner light meant essentially that she would follow it unfailingly, even though she was criticized frequently for support for Blacks and her refusal to be quiet and stop getting involved in men's work. In 1806, at the age of 13, she boarded at the Nine-Partner School, where she was immersed in its strong anti-slavery curriculum. For a while, she was a leading advocate of what was known as the free produce movement. She often worked in alliance with William Lloyd Garrison and the more radical wing of the anti-slavery movement. David Irish, here in the center, a lifelong resident of Quaker Hill and the Oblong, according to his daughter's memoir, quote, his mind was strongly influenced to an active protest against the evils of slavery. His family used only slave-free products, for instance, maple syrup or linen cloth, until slavery was ended in 1865. He did a lot of writing, and one of his many writings on slavery includes this impassioned and religion-tinged plea. He who can contemplate the wrongs of the slave and the iniquities of the masters with feelings of indifference may justly suspect himself as wanting, not only in regard for the good of his fellow men, but in one important characteristic of a disciple of Christ. By this shall all men know that they are my disciples, if ye have love to one another. And this love leads to its votaries, to quote, undo the heavy burdens, break every yoke, and let the oppressed go free. If this subject, concluded Irish, claimed individual attention proportionate to its importance, the hearts of people would pulsate in a right direction for its extinction. Now, Aaron Powell is less well known, perhaps, but no less important. He was one of the youngest of the later generation of anti-slavery advocates. He was a native of Dutchess County Quakers, and his family moved in his teen years up a few miles north into Columbia County. And there he became enamored with the anti-slavery advocates whom he met through his parents. Getting permission from his father to forego college, he attended his first American Anti-Slavery Society meeting first Anti-Slavery Society meeting up in Washington County. Powell was clearly looking for a cause, and the cause found him. As Powell describes it in his memoirs, he was talking inside a church with a group of convention attendees, and Sojourner Truth, quote, who had been standing alone by the pulpit, came slowly down the aisle to us about midway in the church, and reaching out her long, bony arm, placed her big black hand on my head, saying as she did so with prophetic tone in her peculiar dialect, quote, I've been looking into your face and I sees you in the future pleading our cause. To be singled out and then essentially baptized by one of the national heroines of anti-slavery would, I think, have an impact on any one of us. When I first read this passage, I got the shivers. It was, in a way, the passing on of the torch to a new generation. And so Powell did take up the cause. He was a strong supporter of the free produce movement, editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, and after the Civil War, an advocate for equal treatment of Black Americans and strongly opposed to racism. After the freedom seekers left David Irish or the homes of other Underground Railroad supporters, they could continue on that necklace of freedom. The first stop likely would have been to the home of Charles Marriott, a Quaker living up in Hudson in Columbia County. He was in direct communication with Roland Robinson, who owned that farm Rokeby up at Burlington. We have correspondence from Marriott to Robinson saying that he had just sent 4 men his way and he had got them from David Irish. Not all African Americans in the Hudson Valley were enslaved. During the post-revolution period, some owners were already manumitting their slaves, such as those in the Quaker communities. Others coming into the county helped build a large presence of free Blacks who created their own vibrant communities that served as early sites of resistance and protest. In addition, many of these communities were affiliated with nearby churches, and in turn, those churches were often led by important figures in the anti-slavery movement. So unlike the Quaker Trail, the anti-slavery and underground movement along the River Trail to Freedom moves among and between a wide array of people, places, and events. So we're going to do that same kind of weaving over the next couple of minutes. Freemanville, one of those early Black communities that I mentioned, was located near present-day town of Beekman, over on the east side of the county. It was started in 1818 by free Black Charles Freeman, who owned some land, a free Black owning land stretching between Beekman and the West Pauling area. By the time of his death in 1845, there were several hundred free Blacks living in that immediate area. Likewise, in Baxtertown, in the southwest part of the county near Fishkill along the river, there was a settlement of free Blacks originally who were living alongside Wappinger Indians. They started a church, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Ebenezer Church, which was the center of community life. That area was also suspected of being a safe place for freedom seekers. And another one called Guineatown in Hyde Park, the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was also a place for free Black families. And many of those congregants worked at the, oh, we have it up here, okay. And many of those congregants were free Blacks, one of whom was, Richard Jenkins, shown here on this next slide. Jenkins was a freedom seeker and who stayed at Guineatown and was taken under the wing of the people at St. James. He became the first Black sexton of the St. James Church, and he held that position for 45 years until his death in 1857. For his service, he was given his own family burial plot in the adjacent cemetery. He had his name on a pew inside the church. So here is a runaway who was taken under the wing of a freedom-loving church and became a prominent member of that community. One of the most important Black churches in this movement was the Smith AME Zion Church. They were strongly represented in the anti-slavery movement and often took the lead in the work of moral influence, as we call it. The newly founded African American Episcopal Church in Fishkill was another one. The Poughkeepsie one is what we're looking at here. Reverend Philetus Roberts, the Black minister of the First Christian Church of Stanford, served as a president of the Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society for a while. All of these Black churches and the ministers cooperated with their white allies in the anti-slavery movement, as well as free Blacks in Dutchess County, often organizing their own societies for self-help and protest. Black churches and leaders worked not only against slavery, but also for such causes as public education, temperance, and African-American suffrage. Smith AME is the oldest African-American church in Poughkeepsie. And when Poughkeepsie itself took over all education in the 1840s, all white education, the education of Black children became the responsibility of the Smith AME. The first Congregational church in Poughkeepsie was formed after a February 1837 incident in which the Poughkeepsie Anti-Slavery Society had invited Samuel Gould, a lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society, to speak in Poughkeepsie at the Second Presbyterian Church. A mob attended the lecture, shouted down Gould, and then surrounded and threatened him with violence. The mob followed Gould to the home where he was staying that night and broke all the windows in the house. Now, when the leaders of some of the churches in Poughkeepsie failed to take what its members called a strong stand against the attack, a number of those members left their churches and came out and formed this new First Congregational Church. And of the first 73 men who joined the new church, at least 40 were documented members of local anti-slavery societies. The church rule book required all members to oppose, quote, the buying or selling of human beings or holding them in involuntary servitude, close quote. And the FCC became one of the most influential churches in the county. Dozens of its members were signers of the various anti-slavery society manifestos. One of those members of the FCC was Samuel Ringgold Ward, perhaps the most prominent African-American abolitionist who lived in the county. He taught at a local school for Black children and later was ordained a minister out of First Congregational. He had strong ties to David Ruggles, head of the New York Vigilance Committee, and there is a strong possibility that the two worked together to funnel freedom seekers from New York City up to Poughkeepsie. Ward was in great demand as a speaker, but complained that, quote, most places on the Hudson River were thoroughly and hopelessly pro-slavery. Many churches and meeting halls were closed to him. On one trip, the wheels from his wagon were stolen. In the 1840s, Ward left Poughkeepsie and went on to become the nationally prominent lecturer and organizer against slavery. Now, akin to the organized anti-slavery movement by Quakers in the late 1700s, a new wave of organized activity came along in the 1830s. In 1833, the creation of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Boston marked the rise of this new radical anti-slavery, abolitionism in essence. Unlike earlier groups, the American Anti-Slavery Society called for the immediate emancipation of slaves. And it was during this period when Dutchess County got its reputation as an outpost of radical anti-slavery. In 1834, just 1 year after the National Association, local anti-slavery and abolitionist folks created the Poughkeepsie Anti-Slavery Society. However, despite this ratcheting up in sentiment, the Poughkeepsie Constitution ends with the suggestion that moral suasion is the right path to take in fighting the evils of slavery. The fundamental principles of this society, it read, are that slavery is a stain upon our national character, that it is founded on injustice and is consequently a sin, that to be silent and inactive is a tacit assent to its perpetual existence and a national evil, while a powerful moral influence is the only weapon which might be used against it. Four years later, the Dutchess County Anti-Slavery Society was barely a year old. And the countywide organization in its formation took on a stronger anti-slavery position. Quote, resolved that we will neither vote for nor support the election of any man for president or vice president of the United States, or for governor of lieutenant governor, or for any legislative officer who is not in favor of the immediate abolition of slavery. This was a stronger call to action, voting as an action against the proliferation of slavery. And just 2 years later, the Dutchess County group jumped in full-blown in support of the Underground Railroad, resolved that we collectively and severally will do all in our power to assist those brethren coming through this county who may have thus far escaped the iron grasp of tyranny by giving them meat, money, and clothes to enable them to prosecute their journey to a land of liberty. This is an open, full-blown embrace of assisting freedom seekers along the Underground Railroad. It's a pretty amazing document. What we don't have enough of, unfortunately, for all of those names that are signed there underneath the eagle is how many of those people actually participated, had an opportunity to participate, etc. But here we move from moral suasion, through some action, voting, obviously a very important action, and here to outright support for the Underground Railroads. Also important to note here is that in most of these anti-slavery papers and positions that were taken in many towns in Dutchess County, both men and women were signers to these documents. There was opposition to all of this in the Valley. Danger was everywhere. Anti-slavery meetings were broken up. There were harassment of speakers. There was police action, violence against Blacks, free and enslaved, and their white allies could be found up and down the Valley. Pro-slavery attitude Ward found in his circuit lecture echoed the constrictions on the enslaved people who were under the watchful eyes of various police units. In Ulster County, the Society for the Apprehension of Slaves was started in the 1790s by slave owners who wanted to ensure that they wouldn't lose their property. They commissioned a group of writers, as they were called, to watch over enslaved people identified by the owners as potential runaways. Similarly, a group of Huguenot slave owners near New Paltz, also in Ulster County, banded together to take action against real or suspected threats of flight. They organized their own group to monitor the movement of the enslaved. The dangers to Black and white men and women were widespread. In yet another example of the threat to freedom seekers, the Fugitive Slave Act put everyone at risk. In 1851, a visitor from South Carolina came to Poughkeepsie and recognized a gentleman by the name of John Bolding, who had a business as a tailor and was living in Poughkeepsie. Now, Bolding had escaped from his owner in South Carolina and came to Poughkeepsie around 1840. After his arrest He was taken to New York City, found guilty, not surprisingly, under the instructions of the Fugitive Slave Act, and he was sent back to South Carolina. Residents in Poughkeepsie raised $2,000 to buy his freedom, and he returned to Poughkeepsie, where he lived for the rest of his life. There's a very interesting story here. I didn't talk a lot about James Talmage, who you may recall was the one who wrote the language opposing the admission of the Missouri Territory as a state unless it put itself on the track to abolition of slavery. And it was James Talmage's cousin, Benjamin Talmage, working as an attorney for the southern area of New York, who came up to Poughkeepsie and was the one who arrested John Bolding. According to the accounts in the newspapers, John Bolding was held as long as he possibly could be until the train on its way to New York City stopped at the Poughkeepsie station. There was already a crowd outside ready to harass Talmage and his assistant, but that was the safest way to get Bolding to the train in quick time without having to come under too much strain from the crowd. Now, this is a little curious, a curious question for those looking for information about the progress of the Underground Railroad and incidents, et cetera. And I take this from various readings, but I'm relying here a lot on Fergus Bordewich, who some of you may know of and who wrote an important work on the Underground Railroad and spent a bunch of time here along in Dutchess County. Fergus was one of the original researchers for our guidebook. He noted that the stories and contemporary news pieces about the Underground Railroad seem to have fallen off, what he says is dramatically, by the end of the 1830s. And with no other discernible explanation, Fergus suspects that what was called the Transportation Revolution was responsible for this, a combination of riverboat traffic on the Hudson River and the Erie Canal provided quicker and safer routes to freedom than overland walking or carriage trails. It would be much quicker to go by steamboat. It could take anywhere from 7 to 10 hours to get up there. Overland walking trail might take you a week or more. And you could also take perhaps one of the packet boats going west on the Erie Canal. So that would require, I think, some more research at this point, but it does seem that there was a falling off of news stories, et cetera. And also a curious incident is that news notices and newspaper accounts and flyers for all of the various Dutchess County anti-slavery societies also fall off around 1840. It's not clear what the reason is. There is some suspicion that perhaps those societies ended for lack of support internally, or they came under more pressure because what was happening, of course, as the 1840s were progressing into the 50s, abolitionism was taking a stronger hold of the national anti-slavery movement. And there were a lot of people who were ardent anti-slavery people, but who thought abolition was an abomination. So there's complex forces at play here. And this period, the 30s into the 40s and 50s for this region would warrant us some more study. Now, Frederick Douglass, in reflecting on the freedom of the enslaved people with the passage of the 13th Amendment had some worries and concerns about what was going to happen. Though no longer bound to enslavement, he did not trust the government or others to make good on the new legal rights that implied equality for Black people. If freed Blacks would now suffer the same or similar abominations, and they continued to live in the same type of constant danger to both themselves and their goods, by what other name would they then be called? The situation essentially would be the same. So the spaces of danger continued despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And just as a couple of examples, and I'm sure everybody on this call could name 6 more, in 1957, a gentleman by the name of Arrington High, resident of Mississippi, got himself arrested for writing pro-integration articles in his newspaper. He was declared insane, a perhaps not ironic verdict for a Black man arguing for integration in Jim Crow South, and he was sentenced to life in an insane asylum. With the help of some friends, he was able to escape and put into a pine coffin, where a hearse drove him to a train station in Alabama, and Mr. High arrived in Chicago 15 hours later. Shades of Henry Box Brown. This incident came during the so-called Great Migration of the 20th century, but this was hardly a voluntary move from south to north. Here in New York, many of you are familiar with the Mohonk conferences that took place in the 1890s. A lot of them on contemporary issues, economics, et cetera, and 2 of them were on the so-called Negro problem. There were no Negroes invited to these conferences. And a reporter asked one of the organizers why no Black people were invited. "You don't include the patient," he replied, in a discussion by his doctors of his treatment. And just a few years later, a Port Jervis resident, Robert Lewis, Port Jervis is down on the far corner of Orange County in New York. Robert Lewis was falsely accused of accosting a young woman and immediately dragged through the streets. A mob lynched him, one of over 4,000 lynchings that took place between 1877 and the 1950s, as recorded by the Equal Justice Initiative. Lewis's was the only lynching that took place in New York. There's going to be a memorial march for him on June the 2nd in Port Jervis. And I know some of the people on this who are watching today are planning to attend. Little Africa on Fire was the description of the burning and destruction of Greenwood, the Black section of Oklahoma City in 1921, where perhaps as many as 300 Blacks were killed. Huge sections of Greenwood were destroyed by fire. And that anniversary is coming up in 19th, I think 10 days, May 31st. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, May 31st, June the 1st. Driving while Black, of course, is the sardonic twisting of the better known driving while drunk or driving while intoxicated. What it really signifies, of course, is racial profiling of Black motorists. Its use has resulted in dangerous encounters between police and Black drivers. When traveling, it was difficult for Blacks to find safe destination. But for over 30 years, the quote, Negro Motorist Green Book, close quote, was published by Victor Green to help Black travelers find safe and friendly accommodations. And the erasure of history, the erasure of the space that people occupy, there were so many examples of the rewriting, the lost cause, etc., the rewriting of the slavery movement, the rewriting of the Civil War, etc. And it blossomed into something called the Dunning School of History, prominent in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and even further on into that. These historians were anti-Reconstruction, believing that Black people were inferior to whites, talking about the good people of the South. The best antidote to this approach that I've read is David Blight's book, Race and Reunion. If you have not read that book, I would recommend that you do. And I can remember the history textbook that I was using at Marist College when I was there, and it described the abolitionists as hateful people, and they were the ones who started the Civil War. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I will try to answer any questions if you have them.